Great. So we are now entering the final phase of Sefer Shoftim. It begins with chapter 17. And what's going to happen is the Navi, the prophet, will recount two very upsetting stories about that time period. And what's interesting to note here, the first story will be what's known as Pesel Micah, the graven image, or the idol of Micah. Micah is the name of the individual who basically was spreading the worship of this idol. And the second story will be called the Pilegesh Begiva story, the concubine from Gibeah, which ended up in a tragic civil war and the death of many Jews. So the first story that we'll be jumping into tonight is, again, starting in chapter 17. It's going to span over, I believe, 2 chapters, the way our books are numbered, 17 and 18. And we'll dive right in. What's interesting to note is Rashi right off the bat says that this is actually not in chronological order. We just had the story of Shimshon, who was the last judge that we will meet for this book. But Rashi says that the stories that we're about to learn, they actually happened a long time before Shimshon. They happened after the death of Yehoshua, perhaps even before the second judge came into command, Osniel ben Kenaz, if you recall. They happened in that time period very early on in the period of the judges. And if so, the question is, what are these stories doing over here? If it's not in chronological order, what order is it in? So there's one minor point and one major point which make it appropriate to write over here. The minor one is that there is a connection between a very specific amount of money. In the last chapter, we learned about Shimshon and Delilah, and Delilah fell to the bribery of the Philistines. They bribed her with a very specific amount of money. They said, we'll each give you 1,100 silver, which is an enormous amount of money. We'll see that 10 silver was enough to live off of for quite a while. We'll see that today. And they were offering her 1,100 for each Philistine. So you're talking about the equivalent of millions and millions of dollars. And that same amount of money is going to be the way our story begins. So there's a connection between the amounts of money, which is interesting. That's what I think is the Ralbag who said that. But perhaps more significantly, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky and others, they say that this is trying to set up the transition to the next book, which is going to be the book of Samuel, where the Jewish people are going to desire and appoint a king. And these two stories indicate that it was really time for a king, and that there were certain issues that existed amongst the Jews that you couldn't take care of without a king. Okay, these two stories demonstrate the need for a king amongst the Jews. And the person who's writing the books down, you recall, is Shmuel. He's the one who we'll see was initially hesitant to appoint a king. But in the end, at the end of his life, when he was writing these books down, he put it in this order to show that, in fact, it was appropriate to have a king amongst the Jews. And these two stories are indicative of what happens without a king. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to pick up in Sefer Shoftim, chapter 17. It says that there was a man from Har Ephraim, the mount of Ephraim, Ushmo Michaihu. His name was at first Michaihu. Michayehu, maybe you could say. This was his name, and we'll see it will get truncated. It will turn into Micha. And that's going to indicate basically his downfall. Anytime it has the formulation, and his name was so-and-so, that means he was actually righteous. So at the outset of our story, Micha was a righteous person. And after his downfall, the Malbim says the letters Michaihu, those last, the Yud and the Vav, which are part of Hashem's name, are removed from him to indicate that he had lost his high stature. Okay, so there's this man living in Ephraim's territory. Ephraim, again, if Jerusalem is central Israel, more or less, Ephraim is above that. That's the portion of Ephraim. And he told his mother, I know somebody stole 1,100 silver shekels from you, and you cursed the person who did that. And you uttered that curse in my ear. And I want to tell you, mother, I have the money. I took it. So he returns it to her. And she says to him, Baruch b'ni Lashem, as if you are blessed to God. as if to say, my son, I don't want my curse to fall upon you. You are blessed, even though you're the one who stole the money. I don't want you to be cursed. You should be blessed. So right off the bat, it's noteworthy that Micah had this strong connection to money. He was even willing to steal from his mother. As we said, this was a tremendous amount of money, and he stole it from her. But that's just like that was what caused Delilah to fall under the pressure of money. So too Micah, we'll see, falls under the pressure of money. He begins righteous. His mother said, blessed be my son to Hashem. He returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother. And she said to him, listen, I don't need this money back. I resolved. This is a very unusual statement. You ready for this? She says, I sanctified this money to God. She uses the 4-letter name of God. And I wanted you, my son, to make a graven image. And therefore, I want to return this silver to you so you can make an idol from it. This is so perplexing. She's saying, on the one hand, I sanctified this money to God. And then she's saying that the use for which she sanctified it was to make an idol. That is two very contradictory things. Is it Hashem or an idol that she's worshiping? So this basically tells us about the confused state of the Jews at the time. Without a central authority, although you did have a judge that people can go to, but there was no central authority that was ruling over the entire land. And there was a lot of confusion, and there's no temple either. One of the main jobs of the king is to build the Beis HaMikdash, the temple. And they didn't have that then. So there was a lot of confusion. And in her mind, it was not a contradiction to believe in God and also to build an idol. Much like the Jews who built the golden calf, they thought, oh, this is the way that we'll worship God. This is just some sort of physical thing which will help us focus our prayers and our energy. But she was severely mistaken. So you see that in verse number 4, Vayashev et hakesef leimo, he returns the money to his mother as if to say, like, no, I'm not going to build you an idol. He knew better. So instead, what she does is she takes the money, she spends 200 of the 11. She spends 200 and gives it to a smith, and he makes an idol. Vahi beveis Michayu. So they use the 900 shekels that are left after the payment, and they make an idol, and she puts it in the house of Michayu, her son. So he didn't agree to make it, but here he is housing it. And as we know, the more time you spend around bad company, the more it will just corrode your sensitivities, and slowly but surely that evil will penetrate. Right? Human beings are very, very influenced by their surroundings. And Michayu, although he was righteous to begin with, here he is living with an idol. And suddenly the very next verse, number 5, V'ha'ish Micha lo beis Elohim. Micah had a house of worship, and he made himself, this is the same Micah. Vayas ephod u'trafim, and he made an ephod, which is like a garment, similar to the one that the Kohen Gadol wore, that sleeveless garment upon which the breastplate went. U'trafim v'males yad achad mibanav v'hila lechohen. And he trained one of his own sons to be the priest of that temple. He just created a temple for idolatry, Micah. Yes? Yeah, you have a question? You're muted though. If you unmute, I can hear you. Mrs. Bach?
It says he made an ephod and a teraphim. A teraphim. What's exactly a teraphim?
Teraphim are those are the things that Rachel took from her father Lavan. Okay. They are little statues, little icons.
Just little statues. Okay.
Yes. The question here, if they themselves are being worshipped or if they were an accessory to something else, but little statues. That's what they mean.
Okay.
And so he trains his son to be the king. And here the Navi, this is going to be like the refrain for the next couple of chapters. By Amimahem, in those days, verse number 6, Ein Melech B'Yisrael, there was no king in Israel. Ish hayashar beinav yaseh. And everyone did what was straight in their eyes. They said, I have this new great way to serve God. Let's make idols and we can focus our worship through the idol to God. And they have all these great ideas and they think that that's straight. And that's what they did. There was confusion and there was no king to set them straight. The Navi saying this would have never happened if there was a king. That's a very important line. Shmuel is preparing us, the reader, the Jewish people, to want and desire and appreciate the need for a king. Okay, now there is a big fateful event that happens to boost Micha's his new project. Vahi nar mi Beit Lechem Yehuda. There was a lad from the Beit Lechem Yehuda, Mishpachas Yehuda. It says he's from the family of Yehuda, who Levi, who Garsham, but he was actually a Levite. So what does it mean he was from the family of Yehuda? Either it means his mother was from Yehuda and his father was a Levi, or Chazal say it's conceptually binding him to the tribe of Judah, from which came the evil king Menashe, who we'll see later spread idolatry throughout the land. This person was also going to be responsible for a lot of idolatry, although initially that is not his intent. But anyway, this Levi comes, and he's looking for a place to live. So he comes to Har Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and that's noteworthy. Micah was actually a place. He was a person who did a lot of hosting. And any wayfarers, people traveling who needed a place to stay and to eat and to rest, they would come to Micah's house. And this Levite, who's now traveling, looking for a new location, perhaps a new vocation, he comes and he stays by Micah's house. And Micah says to him, "Where are you coming from?" So he says to him, "I'm a Levi, and I'm going to live in a new place." So here I'd like to fill you in with what we're going to find out later. This Levi was not just any Levite. His name was Yehonatan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moshe. This was the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu. If you'd like to skip ahead, and you don't have to take my word for it. In chapter 18, verse number 30, I'll read it to you. It gives you the name of this Levite, and it refers to him as Yehonatan, the son of Gershom, the son of Menashe. But the prophet writes the word Menashe with the nun elevated above the other letters, as if it's out of place. And Chazal tell us what that means is he's really the son of Moshe Rabbeinu. But it added the nun there as to not embarrass Moshe, that he should be associated with a wicked child like this, a grandchild. And it added a nun specifically because Menashe, again, was a personality in the future who would spread idolatry throughout the land, and therefore they'd associate him conceptually as like the grandson of Menashe, even though Menashe didn't exist yet. He was doing the same thing as Menashe. So this Levite was actually a famous Levite. Number one, he was a Levi, which is important. If you want to build the veracity and the reputation of your new house of idolatry, if you get a Levi in there, that's the best you could ask for. That's like a genuine servant of God. He's the priest you want. And this is not just any Levi. This was the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu. He had yichus. He had a great family lineage. So this is going to get everybody streaming to Micah's house of idolatry. So Micah urges him, "Please stay with us. I'll let you be the priest. You take control." So jumping back.
So that places this person at about 40 to 60 years old, because Moses died at 120, Joshua died at 110. So this was the grandson of Moses.
Yes.
If the grandson was born on the day Moses died, it would be 40 to 60 years old.
Very good. I mean, assuming this is after the death of Joshua and not at the end of the book of Shoftim.
No.
Right? Very good.
No, because Joshua died at 110.
Yeah.
And he was about 40. No, he was about 50 when he went into
Israel,
promised land.
This would make his grandson. Now his grandson is at least a lad, right? You got to give him 10, 13 years. So this would put him actually in the 70s or so, 60s, 70s.
Yes.
Right. And what we'll actually find, he ended up living for a very, very long time. This grandson of Moshe.
Okay.
So he merited having length of days. So you're at this point, you're right. Maybe he's about 70 at least. Very good. So Micah propositions when he says to him, Shivai Medi, sit with me, and you will be for me an Av, like a father, a mentor, and a Kohen, you'll be the priest of my temple. Like now he's pushing his son aside, like you're the guy I want for the job. And I will give you 10 silver pieces for a year. Le'ami means days, which usually means a year. And I'll give you clothing, like summer clothes and winter clothes. And I'll give you your sustenance. Vayelecha Levi. And interestingly, the verse says, and the Levi went. Where did he go? It means he went after the word of Micah. Initially, he didn't want to take the job as a priest. He realized this is not a good thing to be doing. But once again, money talks, and that is the link between the past two sections. Just like money convinced Delilah and money convinced Micah, money is now slowly going to convince the Levi. So initially, the Levi just went into Micah's house, and he didn't serve as the priest. But eventually, Vayoel Levi lashevet et ish, Levi desired to settle with the man. He ended up being like one of his sons. And ultimately, in the next verse, number 12, eventually, he installed him as a Levite, as the priest of his temple. And now Micah says to himself, so twisted, now I know Hashem will do good for me, because the Levite has become my priest. I've got the number one Yichus guy on my team. I've got Moshe Rabbeinu's grandson. I've got a real live Levite here on my side. I know that Hashem is with me. Yeah, the bad guy never thinks he's the bad guy. Everyone thinks they're doing the right thing. And here he's convinced himself, look, this is a sign from God that he's with me. He sends me a Levite. A Levite, right? Typically, these were men of God. They had no land of their own. Their sole job was to teach Torah. They lived off of the tithes. And once again, the prophet repeats in the beginning of chapter 18, in those days, there was no king for the Jews. And now we have another story that's going to overlap with ours. The Danites, who lived on the western shore of Israel, but also in the very far northeast, they had a section over there, they felt they didn't have enough land. The reason is probably because they couldn't drive out the enemy completely from their lands that they inherited. And also their population was growing tremendously. So they were on the search for a new territory to conquer. So they sent out 5 soldiers, basically, to spy out the land and investigate to see where they can conquer. Where's the next stop? So sure enough, whenever you're traveling and you're passing through Ephraimite territory, you end up at Micah's house, because Micah was the station for travelers. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says, why doesn't Micah lose his share in the world to come? He did such awful things. He opened up a house for idolatry and ended up becoming a very, very awful thing. Why doesn't he lose his share in the world to come? The Gemara answers, because he would always feed the passerbyers, and his house was one of achnasas orchin, of accepting travelers and accepting guests. So this merit actually stood for him. And we see throughout the story, the Levi ends up at his house when he's traveling, and now these 5 men of Dan end up at Micah's house when they're traveling. And they sleep there. And sure enough, they overhear this Levi, who is the priest of Micah's temple. And they say to him, hey, aren't you a Levite? And they say to him very interestingly in verse number 3, chapter 18, Mi haviacha halom, who brought you here? Uma ata oseh bazeh, and what are you doing here? Uma lecha po, and why are you here? They ask him 3 different questions, which are basically the same question. What are you doing here? So Chazal pick up on this. This is very unusual. First, you don't, like barrage a person with questions when you first meet him. What are you doing here? What's your job? Where are you? They were asking him one singular question. And these 3 different words in Hebrew are very significant. So I'll read them to you one by one. In verse number 3, who brought you here? The expression in Hebrew is, Mi haveacha halom, who brought you here? Uma ata oseh bazeh, and what are you doing here? Uma lecha po, what do you have here? So in English, the word here is repeated 3 times. But in Hebrew, there's 3 different words for the word here: halom, bazeh, and po. They said to them, they were saying to him, what are you doing in a house of worship? You are the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu. And these 3 words are allusions to Moshe's illustrious history. Halom was when in the first encounter with Moshe by the burning bush, it uses the word halom. Umat haoseh bazeh is when Hashem asked him, Ma zeh be'adecha, what is that staff in your hand? What is that in your hand? That's the word zeh. Umalacha po, Hashem said to Moshe, Ata po yamodi madi, you stay here, stand with me, God said to Moshe on Mount Sinai. So they're saying to him, your grandfather was Moshe. What are you doing in a house of idolatry? They were shocked. They recognized him. These 5 Danites happened to pass through Micah's residence, and they recognized this Levite who used to be a good guy, and he's descended from great people. So he says to them, Micah hired me, and I became a priest for him. That's what he says. So they said, okay, so listen, we're looking for a new territory to conquer and to live in. Why don't you ask Elohim? And there's a question here if this is a holy name and referring to God, or if it's a mundane name referring to idolatry. It was that unclear whose side people were on. Were they mistakenly also worshiping idols, or were they actually still believing in God? But they said, why don't you ask God, and he'll let us know if we're going to have a successful mission. So he says to them in verse number 6, very notably, he uses the 4-letter name of God. Go in peace. Nochach Hashem darkechem asher telchu ba. Your way, your journey is in accordance with Hashem's desire. So this fellow, Yonatan, he was still a believer of God. He was speaking with the name of God. As we said later, he's going to live very long. In fact, he's going to be in charge of the treasury of King David. Much, much longer. By what did he merit such long days? So they said he was really just in it for the money. This is what the Talmud says. He was really just in it for the money. And when people will come to offer a sacrifice to the idol in Micah's temple, he would say to them, listen, the idol has not eaten yet. How do you expect him to do anything for you? Why don't you go bring some flour and eggs? Okay, they come back with flour and eggs. He says, okay, the idol will take care of you. And once the people leave, Yonatan would have a nice meal for himself. So he really just wanted to fill his belly. He himself didn't believe in the idols. Now that's no excuse. You're not supposed to be doing things like this. But he was not really serving the idols, and he ended up, since he didn't believe in it, apparently he merited a length of days, and he ended up doing teshuvah, and his name changes later to Shivuel, one who returned to God. So that's the PS of the story, but we're still in the midst of it. Okay, so either way, he blesses these 5 gentlemen and he sends them off on their way. These 5 people go, and they end up at a town called Laish. Laish was a town of non-Jews, and they saw that the people who lived in Laish were living securely. They had no need to make war. They had no leadership. They weren't trying to expand their territory. So basically, they were a perfect, unsuspecting victim. If you wanted to make an attack on them, they had no strong army, and they had no leader to defend them, etc. So the people of Dan said, "Oh, this is perfect. We can conquer this city, easy peasy, and we'll live here." And this is not the way of making Jewish war. The way that they'll do it, we'll see. They'll just come and they'll burn down the entire city. But there was no king, and they didn't go through the standard modes of offering peace and a treaty, and you can pay taxes to us, or you can run away. They just, as we'll see, they weren't doing it the straight way. This was each man for himself, because the Jewish people lacked a king. So the spies go back to their brothers. They said, "We've seen the land, and don't be too lazy. Come inherit the land with us. It's a place where there will be no shortage of anything that is in the land. It's a good place." They journey forth from there, 600 men girded with weapons of war. They encamp in Kiryat Yearim in Yehuda, that's the south of Israel. And from there, they went to Mount Ephraim. They traveled north, and they arrived near Micah's house. Now, here comes a very tragic incident. In verse number 14, verses chapter 18, verse 14, the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land of Laish spoke up and said to their brothers, "Did you know that in these buildings there are an ephod and icons, teraphim, carved image and a molten image? Now you know what you should do." They break into the house. It's at the house of Micah. They say hi to the Levi, and the 600 men standing there, they took the idol. They lakhu et hapesel v'et ha'ephod. This is verse number 17. They took the idol and the ephod and the teraphim and the icons and the molten image. V'hakol nitzah petach hashar v'sheish me'ot ha'ish hachagor klei hamlacha. They break into the house of worship and they steal the idols. Maybe for like good luck. They're trying to establish a new city. They say, "Hey, we'll need these guys. We need special power on our side." They took everything. And the Kohen, right, Moshe's grandson, who's the priest at that temple, he comes out and he says to them, "What are you doing?" So they say to him, "Silence. Why don't you come with us? Do you prefer to be the priest in charge of one man's temple, or you could have an entire tribe's temple under your control? We're going to give you a promotion. Don't worry. You come with us. We would like to have the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu serving in our new temple in our new city. You come with us, take the job, and stay silent." And sure enough, that's what he does. In verse number 20, "Vaytav lev hakohen v'yikach et ha'ephod et ha'terafim v'et ha'pasel v'yavo b'kerev ha'am." We see once again he was swayed by money and the offer for a higher authority, for a higher position, and he goes with the Danites. Okay, so what just happened was Micah had a little temple, house of worship. The 600 Danites, on their way to conquer new territory, stopped by Micah's house, stole the idol, and the head priest. They hired him, right? They poached him, they got him, and now they're traveling to the new city. On their way out, Micah runs out, and he says to them, he chases after them and he catches up. And they say to Micah, "What concerns you that you have been mustered? Why'd you come after us?" And he says to them, "You took my God that I made and the priest that was in charge, and you've gone away. What more do I possess?" How upsetting, right? You've taken everything from me, he's telling them. You've taken my avodah zarah, you've taken my head priest. How can you say to me, "What am I doing here? What concerns you?" They say to him, "Listen, buddy, we're 600 soldiers. We're upset. We're on the way to war. Don't bother us. And you bring about the death of yourself and your household if you keep coming." So he has to stand down because he's weaker. And the children of Dan go and they destroy the city. They came upon Laish. There was no one to save the non-Jews there. They destroy the city and then they build it up. Just reading from chapter 18 now. And they named that city Dan after the name Dan of their ancestor was born to Israel, to Yaakov. But Laish was the name of the city at first. And very sadly, in verse number 30, "Vayikimu lahem b'nei Dan et hapasel." The children of Dan established like a new temple. They set up this graven image. And here is the Levite's name revealed to us at last. Yehonatan ben Gershom ben Menashe. That's the name of the Levite, who was the priest now. Hu avanav choanim l'shevet hadani. Him and his sons served as priests in that tribe's temple. Ad yom galot haaretz, until the day of exile from the land. And this idol was the centerpiece. Okay, that is, here the curtain closes on the episode known as Pesel Micha. So in short, Micha's mother was a confused lady. She hired somebody to make an idol. Micah, her son, ended up, although he was righteous, ended up succumbing to the fact that he was living around an idol. He became in charge of the temple. He hired a priest who was the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu in order to increase the importance of the place. But the nation, the tribe of Dan, on their way to find new territory, they steal the priest, they steal the idolatry, and they set up their own new place in this newly conquered territory. And it says that temple remained there until the day of the exile. So this happened, like we said, in the beginning of the period of the judges. And this temple was around through the days of all the Shoftim that we had just learned about. Although there were many great leaders to the Jewish people, Osniel ben Kenaz and Devorah and Shimshon, all the leaders that we learned about, none of them were able to get rid of this pesky little idolatry. And it was in a competition with Shiloh, where the Mishkan, the tabernacle was. The location of this place that they set up the new temple was 3 mil, which is about 1.5 miles, let's say 2 miles away from the main tabernacle in Shiloh. And the Gemara describes, as the smoke rose from the altar in Shiloh, from the sacrifices to Hashem, smoke was rising as well from the sacrifices that they were offering in this house of idolatry, and the two pillars of smoke would intertwine, putting in very graphic terms the competition and the trouble that this house of idolatry was causing. It was right there opposite the tabernacle, right? A couple hours walk away. You can get there pretty quick on a horse. And it was in the midst of the Jewish people, and nobody was able to do anything about it. People were confused. They didn't think it was a problem, or if it is a problem, listen, nobody's really in charge, so we can't really tell them to stop. It's not our business. We don't have a singular authority that can actually take control and clean up this mess. So this is such a potent picture about the times. This was a devastating issue. They had idolatry set up in their midst. Now, very interestingly, there's a cryptic piece of Gemara which says that the idol of Micah, Pesel Micah, came up with the Jews from Egypt. And then when it was time for the sea to split, the angel said, how could we split? We're going to split for this idol? Because the idol was there with the Jews. This Pesel of Micah was there with the Jews as they were crossing the sea. And Hashem said, you should split anyway. But how could this be? We are reading now that the idol was carved, many, many hundreds of years later, when they entered Israel by the person Micah's mother hired. So what does it mean that they had crossed the Red Sea with it? So there are two answers that are both part of the truth. Number one is there was a very specific name of God that was written on a piece of paper that enabled this idol to have special power. This was the piece of paper that when it was time to leave Egypt, Moshe had to take the coffin of Yosef. The problem was the coffin of Yosef was deep in the Nile. So he wrote a special name of God on a parchment, and he put it into the river, and the coffin of Yosef came up, and he was able to take it. That piece of paper, one of the Jews snuck and grabbed it. And it was with that piece of paper that they were able to infuse the idol of Micah with special power that gave it such a powerful influence over people. That's a midrashic take on it. So the idol of Micah was going through them in the Yam Suf. What that means is they had the ingredients there which would create the idol. But perhaps more to the point, what Chazal are saying there is that the root of idolatry, that tendency to believe in something other than God, or even if you're trying to worship God, to use intermediaries and to not believe that we're able to connect to God directly, that lack of faith was coming with them through the Yam Suf. That's what that means. It's saying conceptually, the idol of Micah, meaning the capacity to worship such a thing, the ability to fall so low, that lacking was present right when they were leaving Egypt. They had not uprooted it from them. And therefore, it was only a matter of time since until this pernicious weed would grow and grow and grow, and finally it would manifest in the idol of Micah. And it was none but a king but in Israel that can mow it down or to uproot it. In order to uproot such a thing, you have to have a king who can unify the nation, who can unite the nation and beat it out of them, basically, right? Through devoted service to God. So it's an interesting point. Now, what does it mean that The idol was there until the days of exile. So the most reasonable approach time-wise means until the ark of Hashem was taken, stolen by the Philistines. We'll see in the days of Saul, until the ark was taken. That at that point, then the idol of Micah was like wiped out. Alternatively, it was there even though it wasn't being used. It was there until the Jews were exiled. Like when Sancherib exiled the tribes many hundreds of years later. But it wasn't such a popular location for people, and therefore they just let it be. It's two different interpretations in terms of what that means. But either way, this is the story of what's known as Pesel Micah, the idol of Micah. It's there to show us the need for a king and the lacking that was latent in the people. It also shows us the evil and terrible power of money to corrupt a person. Regarding the number 1100, we'll finish with this. The very specific number of 1,100 silver pieces. Rav Tzadok HaKohen Milublin points out that that's a very particular number. The number 1,000 in Hebrew is Elef. That is the highest number you will find, meaning you have ones, tens, hundreds, and then thousands. Beyond that, there are no units. You could talk about a number of thousands. You'll have a revava, which means a myriad, which just means many. The word just means many, ribu. So 1,000, he says, is basically the cap, the limit of wealth. If a person wants to achieve wealth, you got 1,000, you got it. To go beyond 1,000, it's talking about a desire without any boundaries, a boundless desire and craving is symbolized by the number 1,100, 1,100 more than that. It's beyond 1,000, beyond the limits of wealth, beyond the limits, basically. 1,000 represents the limits. He says, Rav Tzadok says that craving should be reserved and dedicated to spiritual attainment, which is in fact boundless. God is without boundary, and our yearning and craving to connect to Him should be without boundary, and we're just cuckoo for it. But often the Yetzer Hara tries to hijack that feeling. The human needs to connect to something and be obsessed over it and want infinite amounts of it. The Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, has the ability to hijack that feeling and direct it towards worldly pleasures, specifically money. A person wants infinite money. Right? You could have all the money in the world, and you only want double that. Right? You will never be satisfied. The person who wants money, as it says in Proverbs, will never be satisfied by money. The more you have, the more you want. If you have 100, you want 200. If you have 200, you want 400. Right? It only increases your appetite. So the number 1100 is significant in that it symbolizes the boundless desire for money if that desire gets loosened to a person. And we see that it influenced Micah. It influenced the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? He initially took the job with Micah, and then he ended up taking the job with Dan. Right? They said it will increase your honor, increase your salary. And, that's another one of the warnings here. Okay, that wraps up chapter 18. And God willing, we'll forge forth next week with the final story of the book of Shoftim. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was
Nice learning with you. Good to see you.